My name is Alan Morinis, and for the last 15 years, I've been very engaged with a Jewish spiritual tradition called Mussar. And in fact, by this time I've become a teacher of Mussar, somebody who's interested in propagating Mussar in our world. It's an 1100-year-old Jewish spiritual tradition, and it's kind of an odd thing that I find myself calling myself a teacher of Mussar because although I grew up in the Jewish world and I had a Jewish family and grew up with quite a strong Jewish identity, Jewish religion and Jewish spirituality played no role whatsoever in the house I grew up in. And even as I grew up and I began to ask questions about life and began to search more, it never crossed my mind to look into the Jewish world. When I was 18, 19, 20, I began doing yoga. And then when I went to graduate school, I became an anthropologist. And I was given a choice of subjects as an anthropologist. And one of the areas I could specialize in was India. I jumped at that opportunity. When I finished graduate school, my wife and I decided to go on a trip to India. We didn't know we'd end up spending 2 years there. Then in a third year, when I did my graduate work for my doctorate on Hindu pilgrimage, that's how far I had moved away from the Jewish world. But I grew up in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, and the spiritual search was not part of the Jewish world at that time. Jews have always been spiritual seekers, ever since the time of Abraham. But in that generation, the post-war generation, anyone who was a spiritual seeker in the Jewish world, for the most part, had to seek elsewhere. And you found that Jews became Buddhist meditation teachers, yoga teachers, psychologists, many different ways of searching, but no one was searching in the spiritual paths of the Jewish world. And when I was 47 and had already gone through 2 careers and began to question my own life and what was important and how I was going to find guidance for living the rest of my life, I formed a hypothesis. I asked myself something. I said, is it possible that the Jewish world and the Jewish community could have existed for 3,500 years, as it has, and ignored the inner life of the individual? My experience growing up in the Jewish world, and I think it's true of so many people, was that the inner life was not part of the Jewish agenda. The Jewish world was busy building communities, building synagogues, building schools, creating institutions, but the inner life of the individual was not on the agenda. There was no place, there was no focus on what each of us was experiencing individually. And I formed that hypothesis. It can't be. There must be involvement and pathways in the Jewish world for inner searching. And that sent me out reading. I started reading into the Jewish world. And at one point I stumbled over a chapter in a book which talked about the Mussar movement, which took place in Lithuania in the 19th century. And I read this chapter, and I remember reading it. I remember sitting up and saying, this is it. The Mussar movement was entirely focused on the development of the inner qualities of the individual. That chapter was written by Professor Emanuel Etkes, who's a historian at the Hebrew University. And I mentioned that because it was a great gift that it was written by an academic, because there were footnotes and there was bibliography. And I started reading everything I could find on this tradition that I'd never heard the word. I didn't know anything about Mussar, and anybody around me also knew nothing about it. And I read, and for 2 years, that was my primary activity, going through all the books I could find on the shelf in the library. Remarkable to me, this tradition I knew nothing about had so many books, and so many of them had already been translated into English. After 2 years of reading and really becoming convinced that this was a Jewish spiritual path for personal cultivation, I began to wonder if all that there was in the Mussar tradition were these 16th century texts, these 12th century texts, these 18th century texts. But I was living at the end of the 20th century, and I had no idea if this was a living tradition or a dead tradition. And through a little bit of sleuthing, I got the phone number of somebody who I had reason to believe was a contemporary Mussar teacher. And so I phoned him, and his name was Rabbi Yechiel Yitzchak Pear. He is still now the Rosh Yeshiva of the Yeshiva of Far Rockaway, just outside New York. And I called, it was a cold call, and I said, Rabbi Pear, I've been learning Mussar on my own in Vancouver, British Columbia for the last 2 years, and I'm wondering if it's possible. Is there today somebody who could be a teacher to me? Because, you can learn a spiritual tradition from books, but it really isn't the same thing. You need a teacher. You need someone who is a living embodiment of the tradition so you can feel what it's like, feel what kind of person is the outcome of practicing this tradition. So I said to Rabbi Pear, is there a teacher that could be there for me? And he said, hold on, let me get this straight. You've been learning Mussar on your own in Vancouver for 2 years. And I said, yes, that's true. And he said, that's so inspiring. And I said, can I come and meet you? And he said, well, yes. He said, you can come. And I said, when can I come? He said, well, come to Manhattan and phone me from there. Now, I live in Vancouver, which is quite a far way from Manhattan, but my motivation, my passion was strong enough that I did that. I went to Manhattan. I called Rabbi Pear. I said, do you remember me? He said, yes. I said, can I come and see you? And he said, not today. I said, what about tomorrow? He said, yes, you can come tomorrow. So then I hung up the phone really quickly before he could say, call me before you come. Next day, I got on the Long Island Railway. I took the train out to Far Rockaway, took a taxi to the yeshiva, started walking up the stairs, and it struck me that I, who was born a Jew, Jewish parents, Jewish ancestors going back as far as I can know, had never set foot in yeshiva. However, by that time, because I had my PhD in Hindu pilgrimage, I had set foot in hundreds of Hindu temples, irony, but never yeshiva. I walked in, I was directed to Rabbi Pear's office. I came in to meet him. He stood up to greet me. I'm 6'1", he's 6'3", towering man with a long beard. And he came over to me and he said, Shalom Aleichem. And I said, Aleichem Shalom. And he said, may I give you a kiss? And I was stunned. I had had so long to prepare for this meeting, not just the waiting time, but this long flight and the 1-day delay. And I had really rehearsed what I thought was every possible greeting I could receive from this man. And the thought of a kiss, it just hadn't entered my mind. This was completely unexpected. And he gave me a kiss. And then we sat down and I started to ask him questions about Mussar and the Mussar tradition and his experience and how he learned Mussar and what it meant to him. And he kept me with him that first meeting for 6 hours. 6 unbroken hours. I'm a stranger in his world, and that was his gift and his generosity. That was 1999. I continued to explore and develop, and I came to understand that what Mussar is, it's a pathway. It's a pathway of personal spiritual development. It is a step-by-step process. As I've come to say since, there is no elevator to heaven, there is no escalator to heaven. It's a ladder. It is step by step by step. We're called by the Torah and by the Jewish tradition to make our lives into holiness. We are meant to express the inherent holiness of our souls. And the way we do that is by the step-by-step cultivation of the inner qualities. I am now many years past that. This is now 2014. These last 15 years, I have committed myself to the investigation and the sharing of what I myself have found in the Mussar world. And I hope you will go to our website, mussarinstitute.org, find out what Mussar has meant to me and to the thousands of people who have now become involved in this Jewish spiritual path. When I was growing up, when many of us were growing up, the pathways of spirituality were simply, in the Jewish world, were simply not available to us. Now the world is changing. My mission and my joy and my commitment is to open that pathway to you. And so I hope now that the door is open, You will walk through and you will explore.